Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The mirror that showed another world. It was a simple thing really. Just a mirror. Nothing special about it. At least, that was how it appeared when Helen first came across it in the dusty, forgotten corner of the antique store. She had been wandering the city that afternoon, a slight breeze brushing her hair back from her face, feeling the weight of the ordinary day. The sky was dimming with the promise of twilight, casting long, sleepy shadows across the buildings. But for some reason, she had been drawn inside the antique store, a small, cramped space wedged between two much larger, more modern establishments. It was the sort of store where the air smelled of old wood and mothballs, the scent of forgotten things. The shelves were crammed with trinkets and treasures, silver spoons, tarnished jewelry, and faded paintings. Most of the objects seemed to have stories, each one waiting to be discovered, but nothing stood out to her, at least not at first. It was only when she happened upon the mirror that her breath caught. It was standing in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of old chairs. It wasn't anything spectacular at first glance. Its frame was ornate, a faded gold that had long lost its luster. The glass, though, was unusual, almost too clear, too perfect. Helen could see her own reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. It wasn't just the way she looked. No, it was something else. The room behind her, the cluttered shop, the disarray of objects, all seemed to bend and shift unnaturally in the mirror's reflection. A softness to the light, a strange shadow. For a moment, she thought it was just an illusion, an effect of the dim light, but as she took a step closer, she saw it more clearly. The room in the mirror was not quite the same as the room she was standing in. The shelves were arranged differently, and there was a doorway on the far side of the reflection that wasn't there in the actual room. The reflection of the floor was different, too, cleaner, smoother. It looked better. Helen's fingers hovered over the glass. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive, as though it were waiting for something. The chill of the air in the store seemed to recede, and she could hear only the faint thrum of her pulse in her ears. "Is something wrong, miss?" Helen turned quickly to find the old man who ran the shop standing behind her. He was bent with age, his clothes faded and wrinkled, his hair a shock of white against his dark, tired eyes. She hadn't heard him approach. She started, but the words felt caught in her throat. "I think there's something strange about this mirror." The man nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes. That mirror has a way of showing things that aren't always what they seem. But it's not for everyone." Helen frowned, turning back to the mirror. She didn't understand what he meant. Surely it was just some trick of the light, a glitch in her perception. But the more she stared, the more she realized the truth. The reflection of the room in the mirror was not simply distorted. It was alive in a way that her own world wasn't. It was vibrant. It was perfect. "I'll take it," she said before she could stop herself, her hand gripping the cool surface of the frame. The words felt like they had come from someone else, someone more certain than she could ever be. The man didn't stop her. Instead, he simply gave a weary nod. "It comes with a price," he said quietly, his voice more of a whisper than anything else. "But I think you'll know that soon enough." Helen didn't think much of his words. She paid him in cash, and with the mirror tucked under her arm, she left the shop. As she stepped back out into the fading light of the evening, she didn't notice the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer behind her, or how the air had grown still and heavy. She was too focused on the mirror, the way it seemed to pulse with a quiet energy. Once home, she placed the mirror in the center of her living room. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving the reflection as the minutes passed. The room in the mirror was still the same, perfect, unchanging, but now it was a kind of siren call. Every time she looked, something new seemed to appear. There was the distant figure standing in the doorway in the mirror, a person who hadn't been there before. Helen blinked, but the figure didn't disappear. Her heartbeat quickened as she stared at the reflection of the figure, tall, cloaked in a dark, flowing robe, standing motionless just past the doorway in the mirror. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned to look behind her, expecting to find the same person in her real room, but the corner was empty. Turning back to the mirror, she saw the figure take a step forward. Her stomach dropped. She could see the way the figure's form shifted slightly, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The room was empty once again. Helen was breathless. What was happening? Was this some kind of trick? She looked again, but there was nothing in the mirror but the same perfect, empty reflection of her room. But the feeling of something waiting, watching her from beyond the glass, stayed with her. The following days were strange, disjointed. She found herself drawn to the mirror at every spare moment, as though something in the glass was pulling her in. Each time she looked into it, the reflection changed. Sometimes the figure would return, standing in that same doorway. Other times, she saw what appeared to be another version of herself, wearing different clothes, smiling as though everything in her life had turned out differently. But the feeling of something waiting, watching her from beyond the glass, stayed with her. The following days were strange, disjointed. She found herself drawn to the mirror at every spare moment, as though something in the glass was pulling her in. Each time she looked into it, the reflection changed. Sometimes the figure would return, standing in that same doorway. Other times, she saw what appeared to be another version of herself, wearing different clothes, smiling as though everything in her life had turned out differently. She couldn't stop herself. She was obsessed with the mirror now, returning to it again and again. It seemed to offer her glimpses of another world, a better world, a place where she was happy, where everything made sense. And it was always so close, just a stretch of her hand away, if she could only figure out how to get there. The reflection began to shift more dramatically. The perfect room in the mirror was no longer a static image. It became a place, real and vibrant, just beyond the glass. She could see the sun shining through the windows, hear the faint sound of birds singing, smell the fresh air. It was the life she had always dreamed of, the life she was sure she deserved. Every time she looked, it became more real. One evening, after what felt like a lifetime of gazing into the mirror, she saw something new. A door, no longer just a reflection, but one that seemed to pulse with energy. It beckoned to her. She could see the outline of a figure, her own figure, standing just behind it, ready to step forward into the other world. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold glass. The room around her seemed to shift, the air growing thick and heavy as if reality itself were starting to warp. The world seemed to tilt, to bend, and for a split second she felt as if she were falling, not physically, but in some intangible way. The mirror shimmered before her eyes, and just as quickly as the sensation had started, it stopped. She was standing in her own living room again. But something was different. The room felt glum. The light was too dim, the air too cold. The walls were slightly crooked. It was as if she had stepped out of one world and into another, a mirror image of her own life, but distorted, warped. And in the mirror, the figure, the one that had always appeared just out of reach, was now standing behind her. It was smiling, but it wasn't her smile. As Helen turned to face the mirror once more, she realized with a growing horror that she was no longer looking at herself. She was looking at someone else. Someone who had taken her place. The mirror, she realized, had never shown another world. It had shown her the world that was waiting to take hers. And now it was too late to turn back. The air around Helen felt thick, stifling, as if it were closing in on her, suffocating her with a weight she couldn't escape. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The reflection in the mirror, the other her, stood motionless, smiling with an eerie, unnatural calm. Helen's pulse raced as her own hand slowly reached toward the glass, her fingers trembling. She couldn't stop herself. She was obsessed with the mirror now, returning to it again and again. It seemed to offer her glimpses of another world, a better world, a place where she was happy, where everything made sense. And it was always so close, just a stretch of her hand away, if she could only figure out how to get there. The reflection began to shift more dramatically. The perfect room in the mirror was no longer a static image. It became a place, real and vibrant, just beyond the glass. She could see the sun shining through the windows, hear the faint sound of birds singing, smell the fresh air. It was the life she had always dreamed of, the life she was sure she deserved. Every time she looked, it became more real. One evening, after what felt like a lifetime of gazing into the mirror, she saw something new. A door, no longer just a reflection, but one that seemed to pulse with energy. It beckoned to her. She could see the outline of a figure, her own figure, standing just behind it, ready to step forward into the other world. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold glass. The room around her seemed to shift, the air growing thick and heavy as if reality itself were starting to warp. The world seemed to tilt, to bend, and for a split second she felt as if she were falling, not physically, but in some intangible way. The mirror shimmered before her eyes, and just as quickly as the sensation had started, it stopped. She was standing in her own living room again. But something was different. The room felt glum. The light was too dim, the air too cold. The walls were slightly crooked. It was as if she had stepped out of one world and into another, a mirror image of her own life, but distorted, warped. And in the mirror, the figure, the one that had always appeared just out of reach, was now standing behind her. It was smiling, but it wasn't her smile. As Helen turned to face the mirror once more, she realized with a growing horror that she was no longer looking at herself. She was looking at someone else. Someone who had taken her place. The mirror, she realized, had never shown another world. It had shown her the world that was waiting to take hers. And now it was too late to turn back. The air around Helen felt thick, stifling, as if it were closing in on her, suffocating her with a weight she couldn't escape. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The reflection in the mirror, the other her, stood motionless, smiling with an eerie, unnatural calm. Helen's pulse raced as her own hand slowly reached toward the glass, her fingers trembling. It was as though the mirror were alive, its surface rippling as if it were made of liquid. Her reflection, the other woman, moved her lips, but the words were muffled, distorted, like something trying to escape from a deep well. Helen stepped back, her body frozen in a mixture of fear and curiosity. She could feel the presence behind her, the other presence, the one that was no longer just in the mirror, but everywhere around her. It wasn't just an image anymore. It was a force, a presence that tugged at the edges of her mind, that whispered to her from the darkness behind her own reflection. "You have nothing left," the reflection spoke, its voice calm but unsettling. It wasn't quite hers, but it was close enough to make her skin crawl. "This world is not yours anymore. You've already given it up." Helen's throat tightened. She could feel the pull, the unspoken invitation to step into that other world, to leave her own behind. It promised everything she'd ever wanted. The perfect life, the perfect existence, a place where nothing was wrong, where she wasn't haunted by the mistakes, regrets, and fears that had plagued her life. The mirror gleamed, almost taunting her now. The figure, the other her, continued to stand silently, waiting, but its eyes never left her. Helen's body swayed, her mind caught between two worlds. The life she had known, the life she had tried to move beyond, was slipping away. The reflection in the mirror was pulling her in, beckoning her, and part of her wanted to go, to step through, to abandon everything that had hurt her, everything that had held her back. But another part of her screamed to resist. This was wrong. This was not how things were supposed to be. She was not meant to vanish into the glass. She was meant to live her own life, with all its flaws and imperfections. For a moment, she just stood there, torn between the two realities, unsure of what to do. She felt as though she were being pulled apart at the seams, the pull of the mirror stronger than her will to fight it. And then, with a sudden, frantic movement, she reached out and slammed her palm against the glass. The surface rippled, distorting her reflection into 1,000 fractured pieces. She yanked her hand back, gasping, as if the mirror had burned her. The glass was cold now, colder than it had ever been before. It felt as though it were drawing in all the warmth from her body, sapping her energy, her life force. But as she stepped back, her gaze still locked on the reflection, she saw it. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was moving. It reached toward her, its hand extending out of the glass, stretching through the fractured surface like tendrils of darkness. Helen screamed, stumbling backward, her heart racing in terror. Father her, that thing, was coming for her. In a panic, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the room. The hallway was dark, the shadows pressing in around her, but she didn't stop to think. She needed to get away, to escape this thing, this mirror that had ensnared her so completely. She didn't even know where she was going, only that she had to run, had to leave. But no matter how fast she ran, the mirror's reflection followed her. The doorways she passed were twisted, warped. The furniture in the living room looked out of place. The rooms she once knew now felt alien, unfamiliar. It was as though the world around her was bending and twisting, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Each time she glanced over her shoulder, the reflection grew closer, that cold, dark hand inching through the glass, its fingers now brushing the edges of the doorway, reaching for her. Helen's mind spun, and she found herself back in the living room, the mirror still standing there, waiting. She didn't know how she had gotten there, but she couldn't move. The mirror's pull was too strong. She could feel it calling to her again, whispering her name. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure emerged completely from the mirror. It was not just her reflection anymore. It was her. She stumbled backward, her body slamming against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The other version of herself stood before her, taller and more regal, with a smile that was both seductive and cruel. Her eyes gleamed, cold and indifferent, but they knew everything that Helen had ever wanted, every broken part of her soul. The other Helen took a step forward, her footsteps making no sound against the floor, yet they carried an undeniable weight. "You had your chance," it said, its voice smooth and honeyed, but there was a dark undertone to it. "This world isn't yours anymore, Helen. You gave it away the moment you touched the mirror." Helen wanted to scream, to fight, to claw her way back to the life she had known, but she couldn't. The mirror, the other world, was all around her now, closing in, suffocating her with its beauty and its lies. The figure reached out a hand to touch her face, and the world tilted once more. Helen's vision blurred, her mind spinning, and for a moment, she couldn't tell where the reflection ended and she began. "Come with me," the other Helen whispered. "You belong here now. Don't you want to see what it feels like to live without the pain? Without the regret? Without the fear?" Helen's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. She could feel the cold creeping up her limbs, like ice settling into her bones. But just as she was about to succumb to the darkness, to give in to the allure of the perfect life that beckoned to her, a memory flashed in her mind. A brief image of her old life, her real life. She remembered the warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of her friends, the comfort of her family. The things that made her who she was. And in that moment, she found her strength. With a sharp, frantic cry, she shoved herself away from the mirror. The other Helen recoiled, its form rippling and distorting as it reached for her. But it was too late. Helen's hand struck the glass once more, but this time, there was no rippling, no distortion. There was only a sudden, sharp crack. The mirror shattered. Glass scattered across the floor, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The room was silent. The air felt still again, the heavy presence that had once filled the space gone. Helen stood, gasping for air, her body trembling as she looked around the room. It was just normal again. The shadows had receded, the walls were no longer crooked, the air no longer chilled. The mirror was broken, its shards littering the floor. The reflection, the other world, was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Helen could breathe again. She wasn't trapped in the mirror. She wasn't stuck in that false reality. But as she stood there, the shards of glass glinting at her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. She had escaped, for now. But somewhere, deep down, she knew that the mirror's power wasn't gone forever. And that someday, somehow, it would call to her again. Story 2. Footsteps in the dark. The night was thicker than usual, pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket. The air was damp, cool, and smelled faintly of earth. The streetlights, which usually cast a comforting orange glow, had burned out one by one over the past few days. The town of Hollowbrook was now swallowed by darkness. Maggie sat by her window, staring out at the empty street, her mind wandering in the silence. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood, the kind of sound that made the walls feel like they were breathing. It had always been a home of strange noises, but tonight, those sounds were different. They felt purposeful. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging up the window as she tried to peer through the inky blackness. Nothing. No sign of movement. Not even the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional car passing by. The night felt still, unnaturally still. Then she heard it. A soft thud. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, and she turned quickly, glancing over her shoulder. The house was still as it had been moments before, but the sound hadn't come from inside. It had come from the street. Another thud. It was faint, like the sound of someone walking slowly, deliberately, but there was something wrong about it. The steps didn't sound human. They were too measured, too unnatural, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking didn't need to hurry. Her heart began to race, and she took a step back from the window, her hands trembling. She knew she should call someone, her brother, maybe, or the local police, but she couldn't make herself move. Fear had rooted her to the spot, and she could feel it creeping along her spine, its icy fingers making her limbs feel heavy. Another step. Closer. Maggie's eyes darted to the front door. She locked it earlier in the evening, before sitting down with her book and cup of tea. The house was secure, she'd made sure of that. But somehow, the certainty of her safety no longer felt reassuring. The sound outside was too deliberate, too persistent. She pressed her back against the wall, inching toward the hallway that led to the door. The footsteps were now unmistakably closer, the rhythm constant, rhythmic. It sounded like someone was pacing in front of her house, waiting. Waiting for what? Her breath was shallow as she tiptoed toward the front door, straining to hear over the pounding in her chest. She glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing. The darkness outside swallowed everything, making it impossible to discern anything beyond the door. But the footsteps were still there. Suddenly, the door rattled, softly at first, then harder, as if someone was testing its strength. Maggie jumped back, her body stiff with fear. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, but she could hardly keep her hands still. Every instinct told her to run, to flee, but where? The street outside was as dark and empty as the shadows in her mind. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. She held her breath, her ears straining for the faintest sound. Nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The house, which had always been filled with the occasional creaks and groans of settling wood, now seemed entirely still, too still. She couldn't hear anything. No distant traffic, no breeze whispering through the trees. It was as if the whole world had gone quiet, holding its breath along with her. Just when she thought it was over, the thud came again. But this time, it was inside the house. A footstep echoed from the hallway, as though someone was walking through the rooms, right under her nose. Her heart slammed in her chest, and panic surged through her. She backed away from the door, her mind racing for some explanation. An intruder, maybe? But why had they not made a sound when entering? Why had they waited so long? Another step, then another, growing closer, now unmistakably inside the house. The footsteps were coming up the stairs. Maggie's mind spun, but her body refused to move. She wanted to scream, to shout, to warn herself that it was just a bad dream, but the words caught in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, her body paralyzed by the creeping, suffocating fear that wrapped around her heart. A shadow passed under the doorframe. She saw it, dark and indistinct, as it moved slowly, deliberately, closer to the top of the stairs. She was frozen in place, too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. Then came the whisper. It was a soft sound, too soft to be sure, but it came from just beyond the door, from the other side of the hallway. A voice, low, almost mocking, as if it were speaking directly into her mind. "I know you're in there." Maggie's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, too familiar and yet completely foreign at the same time. It sent a shiver through her bones, and in that moment, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. She wasn't alone. The footsteps resumed. Slow, measured, closer. She had to get out. With all the force she could muster, Maggie ran, her footsteps thundering down the hall, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, just away from the sound, away from the house, away from whatever was hunting her. But as she reached the front door, she stopped. The door was open. She hadn't opened it. It had been locked just minutes ago. Her breath caught in her throat. The house wasn't just quiet now. It felt empty, hollow, as if everything had been sucked out of it. The footsteps had stopped, but the air still felt thick, oppressive, as though something unseen was lingering just out of view. And then a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall, shadowy form, its face obscured by the low light from the street lamp outside. The figure stepped forward, its movements deliberate, just like the footsteps. Maggie's mouth went dry, her legs trembling with fear. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took another step. "You shouldn't have listened," it said, its voice gravelly and cold. "You heard the footsteps, but you didn't understand." The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her once again in the house, with nowhere to run. The figure reached out, and with it, the darkness followed. Slowly it swallowed her whole. The air in the house grew colder as Maggie stood frozen in place, the figure's presence suffocating. The darkness that followed it seemed to swirl around her, wrapping around her like an invisible fog. It was so thick now, so heavy, that it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You heard them," the figure repeated, its voice eerily calm. "The footsteps, they were never meant for you to run from." Maggie's heart pounded so violently that she felt it in her throat. She wanted to back away, to make a break for the door, but her legs wouldn't move. She felt as if something unseen was holding her in place, like invisible chains wrapped around her body. The shadows were alive, watching her, suffocating her, and the figure stood just inches away, its face still hidden. "Why?" Maggie managed to croak, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel the weight of the words on her tongue, desperate to be spoken, but they felt almost foreign to her, as though the air itself were dampening her voice. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching out like a dark arm. It was nearly touching her now, the chill emanating from it so intense that she could feel her own body tremble. "You think you're still in control," the figure said, its tone full of quiet amusement. But this place, this house, it has its own rules, its own truth, and you've already become part of it. Maggie tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt constricted, as if something was tightening around it. The shadow shifted once more, and now she could feel it, a cold presence creeping through her skin, chilling her very bones. "You should have left when you had the chance," it whispered, its voice laced with something darker now. "You should have left before the footsteps found you." And then, in that instant, the house seemed to grow even darker. The shadows swallowed the light, and Maggie felt as though she were sinking into the very floor beneath her. The world around her began to blur, the edges of reality melting away, until all that was left was the suffocating presence of the figure and the soft, ever-present sound of those footsteps. The footsteps that never stopped. The figure's eyes, now visible beneath the cloak of shadow, gleamed in the pitch blackness, empty, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. She tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break free, but her body was no longer her own. The darkness had seeped into her veins, chilling her from within. A sound came then, a faint, distant echo that barely registered at first, but slowly grew louder. It was the sound of footsteps. But these were different. These were not the careful, deliberate steps she had heard earlier. They were frantic. They echoed through the house like the hurried steps of someone trying to escape. "Do you hear them?" the figure whispered, its voice sending a shiver down Maggie's spine. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The door behind her creaked open, the hinges groaning with the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting. And there, in the doorway, stood another figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured by a dark hood. The footsteps grew louder still, now all around her, echoing in the walls, in the floors. Maggie was no longer sure if the footsteps were real, or if they were in her mind, twisting through the air like a relentless wind. The new figure stepped forward, and Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. It was as if the very air itself was thickening, becoming heavier with each step they took. "Join us," the first figure said, its voice suddenly softer, coaxing. "You've already heard the footsteps. Now you must become one of them." The air grew colder, so cold that Maggie's breath came in visible clouds, and she felt a deep, bone-chilling fear take root inside her. She wanted to scream, to escape, but her feet refused to move. Her legs were like stone, her body paralyzed by the darkness. "You were always meant to hear them," the second figure murmured, its voice thin and hollow. "The footsteps were never meant to be ignored. They were meant to lead you here, to bring you to this moment." Maggie's mind raced. Was she dreaming? Was this some nightmare that would fade once she woke up? But the cold felt too real, the shadows too tangible. Her heartbeat hammered in her chest, but she couldn't make a sound. She couldn't move, couldn't fight back. She was surrounded by the darkness, and the footsteps, endless, echoing footsteps, continued to grow louder, surrounding her. The second figure extended its hand toward her, its fingers unnaturally long, its skin a pale, translucent shade that seemed to shimmer in the absence of light. "It's too late to run now," it whispered, and Maggie felt her body slowly start to move, against her will, toward the figure. The cold seeped deeper into her skin, her thoughts clouded with the terror of what was about to happen. The figure's cold fingers brushed against her arm, and in that instant, everything changed. The darkness folded in on itself, and the footsteps, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with the absence of sound. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Maggie's heart stopped beating for a moment as the figure's grip tightened. She was frozen, her mind reeling with confusion. She tried to scream, to fight, but the moment she moved, the footsteps returned, louder than ever before. But they weren't her footsteps. They were theirs. And in that moment, Maggie understood. She wasn't the one walking anymore. The darkness had claimed her, and now she was one of the footsteps in the dark. The town of Hollowbrook would never forget the strange happenings in that old house. Over time, the house was abandoned, left to rot in the darkness. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls through the trees, people still hear the soft, haunting sound of footsteps echoing down the streets. It's always the same rhythm, the same deliberate pace. And no one dares to question who or what is walking in the dark.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.